The morning sun had barely peeked through the clouds when Lisa arrived at Joe's diner, adjusting her name tag as she pushed open the heavy glass door. The familiar bell chimed above her head, mixing with the sizzling sounds from the grill and the gentle hum of the old ceiling fans. She'd been working here for 2 years now, and the smell of fresh coffee and buttery pancakes had become as familiar as her own apartment. At 23, she was juggling more than just plates and coffee mugs. Between her morning shifts at the diner and evening classes at the community college, every day felt like a careful balancing act. But Lisa had dreams bigger than the chrome-edged tables she wiped down each day. Her textbooks, stuffed in her locker in the back room, held the promise of a nursing degree, a future where she could help people in even bigger ways. The diner sat at the heart of downtown, where office workers in pressed suits shared counter space with construction workers in dusty boots. Lisa loved how the place brought everyone together, a slice of real life served up with each cup of coffee. The worn leather booths had heard thousands of stories: first dates, business deals, family celebrations, and quiet moments of reflection. That Tuesday started like any other. She tied her apron with practiced ease, checked her order pad, and grabbed a fresh pot of coffee. The morning regulars were already settling into their usual spots. There was Mr. Chen from the hardware store, who always ordered wheat toast and scrambled eggs. The trio of retired teachers claimed their corner booth, ready for their weekly breakfast meetup. And good old Mrs. Rodriguez was perched at the counter, warming her hands around her coffee mug while reading the morning paper. Lisa moved between tables with the grace of someone who knew every squeaky floorboard and wobbly table leg. She had a way of remembering everyone's little preferences: no ice in this person's water, extra napkins for that table, and a side of hot sauce ready before it was even asked for. It wasn't just about taking orders. It was about making people feel seen and cared for, even if just for the brief time they spent in her section. The breakfast rush kept her moving at a steady pace. She balanced plates along her arm with the skill of a circus performer, topped up coffee cups before they ran dry, and somehow managed to keep everyone's orders straight without missing a beat. The kitchen staff worked in harmony with her rhythm. They'd developed an unspoken language of nods and quick gestures that kept the food flowing smoothly. As the morning wore on, Lisa caught glimpses of life passing by through the big front windows. Business people hurried past with their briefcases, young mothers pushed strollers along the sidewalk, and students rushed to catch their buses. Each face that passed by had their own story, their own struggles and dreams, just like her. Between refills and orders, she chatted with customers about their lives. Someone's daughter just got engaged, another's son made the honor roll, and Mrs. Rodriguez's garden was finally blooming after the long winter. These little connections, these moments of shared humanity, made every shift worthwhile. Even on days when her feet ached and her textbooks seemed impossibly heavy, these interactions reminded her why she loved her job. The clock ticked toward the lunch hour, and Lisa could feel the shift in energy as the breakfast crowd thinned out and the first lunch customers began to arrive. The menu boards were flipped and the specials were updated. The smell of the day's soup, chicken noodle, began wafting from the kitchen, mixing with the lingering aroma of morning bacon. Little did she know that this ordinary Tuesday was about to become anything but ordinary. As she wiped down a recently vacated table, something caught her eye through the window, something that would set in motion a chain of events that would change not just her life, but the lives of others in ways she couldn't imagine. But for now, she simply straightened her apron, grabbed her order pad, and turned to greet the next customer with her usual warm smile. The lunch rush was winding down when Lisa first noticed him through the streaky diner window. An elderly man stood there, his reflection wavering in the glass like a faded photograph. He wasn't like the usual window shoppers who would glance at the menu and move on. There was something different about the way he studied each item listed, his eyes moving slowly across the prices as if trying to solve a complicated math problem. His clothes told a story of better days: a button-up shirt that had been carefully mended multiple times, pants that hung a bit too loose on his frame, and shoes that had walked too many miles. But it was his posture that caught Lisa's attention most. Despite his circumstances, he stood tall, with a dignity that seemed to push back against whatever hard times had brought him to this moment. As she cleared tables, Lisa kept glancing his way, pretending to wipe the same spot on the window over and over. She watched as he pulled something from his pocket, a small collection of coins that he carefully counted in his weathered hands. The way his fingers trembled slightly as he counted and recounted the same coins made her heart squeeze a little tighter in her chest. Through the glass, she could see him mouthing numbers as he counted. A quarter here, a few nickels there, mostly pennies that he had probably collected over time. The total couldn't have been more than $1, and the cheapest item on their menu was the coffee at $2.50. The realization hit her like a gentle wave. He was trying to figure out if he had enough for even the smallest meal. The scene brought back memories that flooded her mind like warm honey of her grandmother's kitchen, where no one was ever turned away hungry. "Baby," her grandmother used to say, "sometimes the only thing standing between despair and hope is a warm meal and a kind word." Those words echoed in her head now, as clear as if they had been spoken yesterday instead of years ago. Inside the diner, life went on as usual. The cook's spatula clinked against the grill, the coffee maker gurgled as it brewed a fresh pot, and regulars chatted about the upcoming weekend. But Lisa's attention kept drifting back to the window, where the man now had his hand pressed against the glass, right next to the daily special sign advertising meatloaf with 2 sides for $12.99. She noticed how his eyes lingered on the description of the meatloaf, and she could have sworn she saw him swallow hard, like someone trying not to think about how hungry they were. The autumn wind ruffled his gray hair, and he pulled his thin jacket tighter around his shoulders. The weather was getting colder, and the thought of him standing out there, hungry and cold, made her own warm lunch in the break room feel like a luxury. A young couple at one of her tables waited for their check, and as Lisa processed their payment, she found herself glancing at the register's display. Her employee discount would bring the meatloaf special down to $9.75. Her tip from the last table was exactly $10. It felt like more than coincidence. It felt like her grandmother nudging her from beyond, reminding her of those kitchen table lessons about kindness and humanity. The man outside had started to turn away, his shoulders slumped in resignation, when Lisa made her decision. She had been raised to believe that doing the right thing wasn't about calculating the cost. It was about listening to that quiet voice inside that told you when someone needed help. Right now, that voice was practically shouting. She looked around the diner, taking in the half-eaten meals left on plates, the barely touched sides that would end up in the trash. The daily waste she saw made the decision even easier. In a world of plenty, how could she watch someone walk away hungry? The restaurant's policy about giving away food flashed through her mind, but some rules, she decided, were meant to be weighed against human dignity. As she reached for the door, her hand hesitated for just a moment. Not because she was reconsidering, but because she was thinking about how to approach him in a way that wouldn't hurt his pride. Her grandmother had taught her that helping others was an art. It required as much grace in the giving as gratitude in the receiving. With that thought warm in her heart, she pushed open the door, letting the cool autumn air rush in as she stepped out onto the sidewalk. The autumn breeze carried the smell of cooking food as Lisa stepped outside. The elderly man had already started shuffling away, each step seeming to weigh heavy with disappointment. "Sir?" she called out softly, her voice gentle enough not to startle him. He turned slowly, his eyes meeting hers with a mix of surprise and uncertainty. "Would you like to come in and have some lunch?" she asked, gesturing toward the warm diner behind her. "Our meatloaf special today is really good." She watched as different emotions crossed his weathered face, hesitation, embarrassment, and something that looked like hope trying to break through. He began, his voice rough from disuse. "I don't have enough." He opened his palm to show her the coins he'd been counting, 87 cents in total. The way his hand trembled made Lisa think about all the stories those hands could tell, all the years of work they'd seen. "Don't worry about that," she said with a warm smile, the kind her grandmother had always used to make people feel at ease. "I'd really love it if you'd join us for lunch." She held the door open, and after a moment's pause, he straightened his shoulders and walked in, trying to maintain whatever dignity life had left him. Lisa led him to a quiet booth near the back, away from the curious glances of other customers. As he settled into the worn leather seat, she noticed how carefully he placed his worn jacket beside him, smoothing it as if it were a fine suit. "I'm going to bring you our meatloaf special," she said. "It comes with mashed potatoes and green beans. Would you like coffee too?" He nodded, and she could see him blinking back tears. "Thank you, miss," he whispered. "I haven't. It's been a while since." His voice trailed off, but Lisa understood. Sometimes the hardest words to say were the ones that carried the most pain. In the kitchen, she put extra care into preparing his plate. She made sure the meatloaf was from the fresh batch, the mashed potatoes were piping hot, and the green beans were the tender ones from the middle of the pan. She added an extra pat of butter to the potatoes and made sure the gravy covered the meatloaf just right. If her grandmother had taught her anything, it was that food made with love tasted better than any fancy restaurant meal. When she brought his coffee, she noticed how his hands wrapped around the warm mug, soaking in its heat. She placed extra creamer and sugar packets on the table, arranging them neatly. "Take your time," she said. "No rush at all." The man nodded, his eyes fixed on the steam rising from the cup as if it were the most beautiful thing he'd seen in days. Minutes later, when she set the plate in front of him, the aroma of home-cooked food filled the air around their little corner of the diner. His eyes widened at the generous portion, and Lisa pretended not to notice as he wiped away a tear with the back of his hand. She also pretended not to see how he said a quiet prayer before picking up his fork with slightly shaking fingers. As she worked her other tables, Lisa kept an eye on him. She watched as he took small, deliberate bites, savoring each mouthful as if it were a precious gift. He ate slowly, methodically, the way people eat when they don't know when their next meal will come. Each time she passed by to refill his coffee, he thanked her with such genuine gratitude that it made her own eyes sting with tears. When he was about halfway through his meal, Lisa slipped into the kitchen and grabbed a slice of apple pie. She warmed it slightly and added a scoop of vanilla ice cream. The kitchen staff gave her knowing looks but said nothing. They'd all seen the man through the window earlier, counting his coins. As she placed the dessert on his table, his fork paused midway to his mouth. "Miss, I can't possibly." He started to protest, but Lisa just smiled. "It's a little something extra," she said. "Everyone deserves something sweet now and then." The look he gave her reminded her of her grandfather, who used to say that kindness was the only thing in this world that multiplied when you gave it away. She knew she was breaking company policy. She knew the cost of the meal would probably come out of her paycheck. But watching this man enjoy a simple meal with dignity, seeing how he carefully wiped his mouth with the paper napkin between bites, noting how he was slowly sitting taller in his seat, it all confirmed what her heart had told her was right. What Lisa didn't know was that her small act of kindness was about to set off a chain of events that would change not just her life, but the lives of many others. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest gestures, like offering a warm meal to a stranger on a cold autumn day. The peaceful moment was shattered by the sharp clang of the kitchen door swinging open. The assistant manager, Mr. Thompson, had returned from his lunch break earlier than usual. He stood at the entrance, his eyes scanning the dining room with the mechanical precision of someone who counted napkins at the end of each shift. The comfortable buzz of diner conversation seemed to dim, as if the whole room could sense the change in atmosphere. Lisa was refilling a customer's coffee cup when she saw Mr. Thompson's gaze lock onto the elderly man in the corner booth. She watched as his eyes narrowed, then darted to the register, then back to the booth. Her hand trembled slightly as she set down the coffee pot, causing a few drops to splash onto the counter. She quickly wiped them away with her cloth, her mind racing as she tried to think of what to say. The assistant manager's shoes made sharp clicking sounds against the linoleum floor as he approached her. "A word," he said, his voice clipped and professional, but with an edge that made Lisa's stomach tighten. He gestured toward the small office near the kitchen, where they handled the daily receipts and employee schedules. As she followed him, Lisa caught a glimpse of the elderly man still eating his pie, savoring each small bite, completely unaware of the storm brewing around him. Some of the regular customers had picked up on the tension. Mrs. Wu at the counter had stopped stirring her tea, and the off-duty bus driver by the window was watching over his newspaper. Inside the cramped office, Mr. Thompson closed the door with deliberate slowness. The small space smelled of paper and coffee, with a hint of the cleaning supplies they used to mop the floors each night. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on his face as he turned to face her. "I just checked the register records for the last hour," he began, each word measured and precise. "There's no payment logged for the meal at table 7. He paused, waiting for her response, his fingers drumming a slow rhythm on the desk between them. Lisa stood straight, channeling her grandmother's strength. "I served him the meatloaf special," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I'll pay for it myself. I have the money right here." She reached for her apron pocket, where she kept her tips from the morning shift. Mr. Thompson held up his hand, stopping her. "That's not the point," he said, his voice rising slightly. "We have policies, clear policies. You can't just give away food because you feel sorry for someone. This is a business, not a charity." The last word came out sharp, like the edge of a newly broken plate. "He was hungry," Lisa said simply, thinking of how the man's hands had trembled around his coffee cup. "I couldn't just." "You couldn't just follow the rules." Mr. Thompson interrupted. "The rules that every other employee manages to follow." He picked up the phone on the desk, his fingers hovering over the keypad. "I have to call the owner." Lisa's heart sank, but she stood her ground. "I'll pay double the cost," she offered, thinking of her textbook money, of her bus fare for the week. "It won't happen again, but please, he's still eating. Don't make him leave." The phone was already ringing, the sound unnaturally loud in the small office. Lisa could hear the muffled sounds of the diner beyond the door, the clink of silverware, the hum of conversations, the soft whir of the ceiling fans. Normal sounds that had always meant comfort to her now seemed to be counting down the moments of her job. Through the office window's blinds, she could see the elderly man dabbing his mouth with a napkin, his movements careful and dignified. A few booths away, a young mother was teaching her child how to fold a paper napkin into a bird. Life was going on as usual, even as Lisa's world was tilting on its axis. The owner's voice crackled through the phone speaker, and Mr. Thompson began speaking in low, urgent tones. Lisa caught phrases like unauthorized food distribution and violation of company policy. The technical terms made her simple act of kindness sound cold and calculated, stripping away all the humanity of the moment. But as she stood there, listening to her actions being dissected and condemned, Lisa felt something unexpected, not regret, but a quiet certainty. She thought of her grandmother's words about standing up for what's right, even when it costs you something. The price of this meal might be her job, but the cost of ignoring someone in need would have been much higher. The conversation on the phone grew more heated, and Lisa could see other employees peering through the kitchen window, their faces showing concern and curiosity. The elderly man was still at his booth, now sitting completely still, as if he had sensed the tension in the air. The afternoon sun streaming through the diner's windows cast long shadows across the floor, marking the moments as they ticked by toward a decision that would change more lives than anyone in that small office could imagine. The owner's verdict came through the phone speaker like a thunderclap in the small office. "Terminate her immediately." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Mr. Thompson placed the phone down with a click that seemed to echo in Lisa's ears. The fluorescent light hummed overhead, a sound she'd never really noticed before, but now felt deafening in the silence that followed. "Hand over your name tag and apron," Mr. Thompson said, not meeting her eyes. His voice had lost its edge of anger, replaced by something that almost sounded like discomfort. Liz's fingers moved to her name tag, the one she'd polished just that morning. 2 years of service, hundreds of customers served, countless coffees poured, all coming down to this moment. As she untied her apron, her hands didn't shake. Instead, she felt an odd sense of calm, the kind that comes when you know, deep in your heart, that you've done the right thing. The apron still held her order pad, some pens, and the morning's tips, little pieces of her daily life that she'd taken for granted until now. Through the office window, she could see the elderly man looking around nervously, as if he'd sensed something was wrong. Other customers were watching too, the regulars who'd come to know her over the years. Mrs. Wu was half standing at her counter seat, her face creased with concern. The off-duty bus driver had put down his newspaper entirely, no longer pretending not to notice. "I'll need to check your locker as well," Mr. Thompson said, following standard procedure like a man following a script he didn't write, but had to perform. Lisa nodded, walking out of the office with her head held high. The short walk to the break room felt like walking through water. Everything seemed slower, more intense, more memorable. In the break room, her small locker held her textbooks, a spare pair of shoes, and a cardigan for when the diner got cold. As she pulled them out, she thought about how just this morning she'd been studying during her break, dreaming about becoming a nurse. The irony wasn't lost on her. being fired for helping someone in need, when all she wanted to do was spend her life helping people. The kitchen staff watched silently as she gathered her things. The cook, who'd always slipped her extra fries during her breaks, wouldn't look at her now. But the new dishwasher, barely older than a teenager, gave her a small nod, a tiny gesture of support that meant more than he could know. As Lisa emerged from the break room, her belongings stuffed into her bag, the elderly man was standing up from his booth. His face showed the dawning realization of what was happening and the shame that came with it. He started to speak. "Miss, I never meant to." "It's okay." Lisa cut him off gently, not wanting him to feel responsible. "You enjoyed your meal, right?" He nodded, his eyes glistening. "Then it was worth it." She meant it, even as she felt the weight of her textbooks in her bag and thought about next month's rent. The diner had gone quiet, the kind of quiet that happens when everyone is trying not to look at something while seeing everything. The only sounds were the soft whir of the ceiling fans and the distant clatter of dishes in the kitchen. Even the traffic outside seemed muted, as if the whole world was holding its breath. Mr. Thompson stood by the register, watching as Lisa made her way to the door. But before she could reach it, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Wu stood up from her counter seat, a coffee cup clutched in her hands. "This isn't right," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "I've been coming here for 10 years, and I've never seen such." "Ma'am," Mr. Thompson started, but Mrs. Wu wasn't finished. "That girl brings light to this place every day," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "She remembers how everyone likes their coffee. She asks about our families. Her voice caught, and Lisa felt tears pricking at her own eyes. The off-duty bus driver had pulled out his phone and was recording everything. Later, Lisa would learn how important that recording would become, but in that moment, all she could think about was keeping her composure as she walked toward the door. Just before she pushed it open, she turned back one last time. The elderly man was still standing by his booth, his dignity somehow intact despite the situation. Their eyes met, and in that moment, something passed between them, an understanding that sometimes the cost of kindness was high, but the cost of turning away from someone in need was even higher. As the door closed behind her, the bell chiming one last time, Lisa stepped out into the autumn afternoon. The sun was still shining, cars were still passing by, and the world was still turning. But something had changed, not just in her life, but in the lives of everyone who had witnessed what happened in that diner. None of them knew it yet, but this wasn't an ending, it was just the beginning. The video started spreading before Lisa even reached the bus stop. The off-duty bus driver had posted it to his social media account, his hands shaking with anger as he typed out what he'd witnessed. "Just watched a waitress get fired for feeding a hungry elderly man," his post read. "This is what humanity has come to. Please share." And share they did. Within the first hour, the video had been shared hundreds of times. People who had never set foot in the diner were commenting, their outrage spreading like wildfire across the internet. The shaky footage showed everything. Lisa's dignified exit, Mrs. Wu's passionate defense, and most powerfully, the elderly man standing there, his face a mirror of grief and gratitude. Local community groups picked up the story first. The neighborhood Facebook page, usually filled with lost pet notices and yard sale announcements, became a hub of activity. Regular customers began sharing their own stories about Lisa, how she'd remembered their children's names, helped elderly customers to their cars in the rain, stayed late to help clean up spills without complaining. By mid-afternoon, one of the local news stations had caught wind of the story. A young reporter, fresh out of journalism school, recognized the human interest potential and convinced her editor to let her investigate. She arrived at the diner with a cameraman just as the dinner shift was starting. The place was unusually quiet, with several regular customers notably absent. Outside the diner, a small group of people had gathered. Some held handmade signs reading "Kindness shouldn't cost your job" and "Humanity over policy." Mrs. Wu was there, having closed her nearby alterations shop early to show support. She spoke to the news reporter, her voice trembling with emotion as she described Lisa's daily acts of kindness. "That girl," Mrs. Wu told the camera, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, "she doesn't just serve food. She serves hope. Every morning, she asks about my arthritis. She remembers that I like my tea steeped for exactly 3 minutes. When my grandson was sick last winter, she saved the last bowl of chicken soup for me to take home to him. The story began appearing on local news websites, each headline more attention-grabbing than the last. Waitress fired for feeding hungry elderly man. Community rallies behind terminated waitress. Act of kindness leads to controversy at local diner. Comment sections filled up with people sharing their own stories of workplace injustice and random acts of kindness. Back at her small apartment, Lisa sat on her worn couch, overwhelmed by the notifications flooding her phone. Former customers had tracked down her social media accounts, sending messages of support and offers of help. Her community college classmates were organizing a fundraiser to help with her tuition. The elderly man's granddaughter had even reached out, sharing how her grandfather had fallen on hard times after his wife's medical bills had drained their savings. The local homeless shelter director gave an interview, explaining how many elderly people in their community were just one meal away from hunger. He talked about dignity, about how asking for help was often the hardest part. His words added another layer to the story, turning it from a simple firing into a conversation about community responsibility and human compassion. By early evening, larger news networks had picked up the story. Their coverage focused on the viral nature of the video, but also delved into bigger issues: corporate policies versus human compassion, the treatment of service workers, the hidden hunger in their community. Each new angle brought more attention, more shares, more outrage, and more support. The diner's review pages were flooded with negative comments. Regular customers posted about taking their business elsewhere. The owner's other restaurants in the area saw their ratings plummet as people connected the dots. The power of social media was turning one small act of kindness into a movement. Local business owners began reaching out to news stations, wanting to be part of the story. A coffee shop owner offered Lisa a job with better pay and benefits. A restaurant chain promised to donate meals to the homeless shelter. A bookstore started a collection for her textbooks. Each offer showed how one person's courage could inspire others to act. The elderly man's story emerged too, shared by his granddaughter. He was a retired teacher who'd spent 40 years in the classroom. After his wife's illness and passing, he'd found himself alone and struggling. His story put a face to the hidden struggles many seniors faced, turning statistics into something personal and real. As the sun set on that autumn day, the video's view count kept climbing. Each share, each comment, each news report spread Lisa's simple act of kindness further into the world. But more importantly, it sparked conversations in homes and offices across the city, conversations about compassion, about standing up for what's right, about the kind of community people wanted to live in. What had started as a quiet act of kindness in a corner booth was becoming something bigger, something that would reach far beyond the walls of that small diner. And somewhere in the city, Lisa's phone kept buzzing with notifications, each one a reminder that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest choices. 2 hours after Lisa had walked out of the diner, her phone rang with an unknown number. She was sitting at her small kitchen table, trying to figure out how to stretch her savings until she found another job. The autumn sun was casting long shadows through her window, and her untouched cup of tea had gone cold. She almost didn't answer, but something told her to pick up. The voice on the other end belonged to the owner of Riverview Restaurants, one of the city's most respected restaurant groups. He spoke with warmth and sincerity that made Lisa's eyes well up with tears. "I saw the video," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "My daughter showed it to me. She was crying when she played it, and I'll be honest, I got a bit choked up too." He paused, and Lisa could hear the genuine emotion in his voice. "We need more people like you in this industry." The offer he made next took her breath away, a position at their flagship restaurant, with double her previous salary, full benefits, and a schedule that would work around her nursing classes. But it was his next words that really touched her heart. "And we want to do more," he continued. "Your act of kindness showed us something we've been overlooking. We're starting a new program at all our restaurants. Once a week, we'll open our doors to serve free meals to anyone who needs them. We'd like you to help us set it up." As Lisa processed his words, her phone buzzed with another call. Then another. Restaurant owners across the city had seen the video, and each wanted to be part of the change. One offered to cater free meals to the local homeless shelter. Another wanted to start a job training program for people trying to get back on their feet. The elderly man's story had touched hearts too. A local senior advocacy group had reached out to help him navigate benefits he didn't know he qualified for. The teachers' union, learning he was a retired educator, had started a fund to help other retired teachers facing similar struggles. Mrs. Wu had transformed her alterations shop into an unofficial headquarters for what the local news was calling the Kindness Campaign. People dropped off donations, warm coats, canned goods, gift cards. Each item came with a note, inspired by Lisa's courage, or paying kindness forward. The off-duty bus driver's video had reached over 1 million views by sunset. Comments poured in from around the world, each one a reminder that kindness knows no borders. People shared their own stories of times when a simple meal or act of compassion had changed their lives. That evening, as Lisa sat in the owner's office at Riverview Restaurant, signing her new employment contract, she thought about how much had changed in just a few hours. The owner's daughter had joined them, her eyes bright with excitement as she explained their plans for the weekly community meals. "We're calling it Open Hearts, Open Tables," she said, spreading out the draft flyers they'd designed. "We want to make sure nobody in our community goes hungry, and nobody feels ashamed to ask for help." Lisa's nursing textbooks sat in her bag, no longer a weight of worry, but a promise of the future. Her new schedule would give her more time for studying, and the owner had even mentioned a possible scholarship program for employees pursuing healthcare degrees. The elderly man and his granddaughter came to visit her that evening at the restaurant. He looked different now, standing taller, his eyes brighter. The community's response had given him back something he'd lost: hope. His granddaughter hugged Lisa tight, whispering thank you through happy tears. As they all sat together in the warm restaurant, sharing a meal that symbolized new beginnings, Lisa thought about that moment in the diner when she'd made her choice. She remembered her grandmother's words about kindness multiplying, about how doing the right thing might cost you something, but the rewards would come in ways you never expected. The local news crew arrived to film the signing of the first Open Hearts, Open Tables pledge. Other restaurant owners had come too, each ready to sign their own pledges. The movement was growing, spreading from one small act of kindness into a wave of change that would touch countless lives. Outside, the autumn evening was settling over the city. Through the restaurant's windows, Lisa could see people stopping to read the newly posted signs about the community meal program. Each person who stopped, who smiled, who took a picture to share, was becoming part of something bigger than themselves. What had started with a simple meal served with compassion had grown into a movement that would feed bodies and souls for years to come. Lisa's act of kindness hadn't just changed her life, it had reminded an entire community that sometimes the smallest choices could create the biggest changes, and that everyone deserved to be treated with dignity, respect, and love.